Here is the mechanism plate. I've cleaned this. I've just used naphtha and cotton buds and toothpicks and the air blower to blow out all the dust and rubbish. It's looking pretty good. I think that the retard gear train moves freely, but I haven't lubricated that at all yet. So I want to lubricate that retard gear train, and normally I use graphite powder to do that job. That's always worked well for me, and the advantage of using graphite powder is that unlike oils, it'll never go sticky with time, and it doesn't gather up dust to form a grinding paste. So I'll find the graphite powder. You can usually find graphite at a hardware store. It's used for lubricating locks, things of that nature. It's not expensive and it's not hard to find quickly. If you live in some tiny village somewhere, you may well not find it, you have to find it online. So I've got some loose in this container because I've used this before, and I'm just going to tip some of that into that speed train, hold back the tab at this end, which brings in the pellets, and just work this backwards and forwards. Just to coat, so that all the mating surfaces are lubricated. I'm just rubbing a bit in there where the pivots are for those wheels too. Now whether that makes much difference or not, I couldn't tell you. It certainly can't hurt. Sounds quieter, so if it sounds quieter, it's probably had some effect. Okay, well, I'm now going to take my air blower, take this away and blow all that out, because I want the loose graphite powder out of that mechanism. You don't want it floating around loose in a shutter, because it'll end up on the glass, on the inside of the lens surfaces as tiny little sparkly bits which will give you flare, potentially. Alright, so we have our blade actuating ring here, the retainer plate, and 3 screws for the retainer plate here, not that one. There it was hiding all along. Okay, the lubrication of our blade actuating ring. I've seen all sorts used there. Graphite powder is what I typically use. You could use a thin wipe of molybdenum paste, a thin wipe of graphite grease even. Basically, we just need to lubricate the surfaces that that blade actuating ring will run on. Just runs on a ledge there. This is the surface that runs on that surface. I'm just running around that inside edge with this graphite pencil. Again, the advantage of using graphite for a job like this is that it'll never go sticky with age, and it won't attract dust. Now this only goes on here in one position. At this point here, that's where we want this tab to come up, the little button with the pin on the top. That couples to the lever that swings this backwards and forwards. Here's the plate that holds it down. You could lubricate this underside of this, the flat side, with your graphite pencil. This only goes on in one position and it has a little rivet on it which locates it, drops into a slot in the body, this rivet here. You've got 3 screws to hold this in position. When you're putting the screws in, run them down very lightly at first until you've got them all in position. And check that the blade actuating ring moves freely and it's not caught underneath something or that nothing's trapped in there. Then tighten the 3 screws down. Check again that the blade actuating ring moves freely. And flip this over, we've got our lever that activates that lever there, the blade actuating ring. Here's our lever and the screw that holds it in position. Now you can use graphite pencil to lubricate that surface and round the central boss. That'll do it. You could use molybdenum paste. Typically what I do is quick wipe through the circular hole where it pivots on the post, quick wipe through the slotted hole where it contacts the pin on the blade actuating ring. Drop that into place. Don't put much lubricant of any sort on there. It doesn't require it and it will not help its action. Now I'll get its spring hooked into place and checking that its action is snappy. That's moving that blade actuating ring backwards and forwards as I move that lever. So that's the shutter together. I'll just check those 3 screws, make sure there's nothing loose there. Very occasionally you'll come across a shutter where the screws have worked loose and one of the screw heads will have risen and caught on a shutter blade, and that'll prevent the shutter from working. Alright, that's all looking good. So now we can assemble the shutter. So unhook that spring, swing this lever outwards, that brings us to the blade's open position, and we can start fitting the shutter blades in place. Now the shutter blades, I've got them all here, all cleaned and ready to go. And I want to start here. Right, with the blades all in position, shutter blades, unlike diaphragm blades, shutter blades stack one on top of the other. So there is the first blade and the last blade. Now we have to get our case in position. The case screws. There are 3 case screws. They are not equally spaced. The 2 that are closest together here need to line up the holes in the case here and in the plate here and here. So if I lower this over the top, I'm going to line up my screw holes fit the 3 screws in place. As with everything else, get the screws in, do them up very lightly indeed. And then check the action, make sure that nothing untoward has happened, like a blade falling out of position is the thing that you'd be most concerned about. If a blade has fallen out of position, it would end up trapped. Now check that the blade actuating ring closes. That looks good. I'm going to put its spring back in position. That seems to work nicely. So I can tighten up those 3 case screws. And check again. That all appears to be good. So we've got our base shutter together now. We've got the shutter blades cleaned, the blade actuating ring all moving freely, the diaphragm cleaned and reassembled back in the case. The scales are back on the outside of the case, and we can start putting the control gear for the shutter in place. Now at this point, that's where the lever comes across and opens the blades on the B and T settings. And this is the lever that does it. And it's retaining screw. It's a shoulder screw. I'm just looking at that lever. I'll check to make sure that it looks all good. Doesn't appear to be bent. Doesn't appear to have any corrosion or damage on it. I'm going to give a wipe through the pivot point of that lever with some molybdenum paste. It sits on here to this side of the blade actuating ring, so that when it's pushed this way it moves the blade actuating ring. I'll put its screw in place. And this will be activated by the shutter release on the B and T settings, and you can see that moves quite well. Now I'm going to give the tip of that lever where it contacts that blade actuating ring a touch of molybdenum paste there, just to make sure its action is smooth, because it has a rubbing action as it swings across there. That seems good. This tiny lever goes in here. Not telling you lies, am I? No, that's right. And that's got a shoulder screw holding that in place. It doesn't move far, it doesn't have much range of movement, but that's quite important. That does the T setting for our B and T lever. Okay, next, what have we got here? This little lever does our B setting. Now this was bent. I've straightened it up. I need to look at it to make sure that I've got it as straight as it should be. It appears pretty good. Now, how did it come to be bent? Well, most likely, given the state of the shutter, most likely someone forced it. trying to get the shutter to behave or do what they wanted it to do. Most likely it was forced and it was bent as a result. So I'll get that in position. Now it's got a return spring on it here, so before I do that, just put the screw on tight. I've got to make sure that that's spring seated. Now this little brass collar goes on here. It goes down into the lever. Run that screw down very lightly and hook the spring in place. Now the tail of the spring hooks onto the back of this little lever here. There's a little notch in that lever that sits into there. Right, now I've just got to get this lever positioned correctly because it's popped off. It's not seated around the bush correctly there yet. Oh, it nearly is. That's better. Yep, that's fine. I'll just tighten that screw up and check the action. Now that seemed to stick there. I've got to determine why it seemed reluctant to move. It could be friction because the lever might be rubbing against the castings. Try lifting it slightly. I think there was friction at this point. When I'd straightened the lever I probably overdid it or hadn't done it quite enough, and there was friction at this point. I just lifted the tip of the lever there slightly, which basically bent it up so that it's no longer touching there. That seems good. That piece is sprung loaded. That looks okay. What do I want to put on here next? This lever. This is the lever that holds the shutter in the cocked position. It also prevents you from being able to depress the shutter release if the shutter is not cocked. I'll just get that shifted around, seated in place. It's held with a single screw. Getting this in place sometimes is awkward. The post on the bottom of that lever has to drop into a hole in the mechanism plate. Now the hole in the mechanism plate falls right on an edge, and so it's quite common for that post to want to go in sideways or not go in properly at all, in which case this lever will sit on there cockeyed and won't work properly. Okay, so in this position this would latch the cocking lever, the main lever, and hold the shutter in the cocked position ready to fire. And when you release it, this would lift and allow the main lever to swing around and activate the shutter. Okay, so that looks okay. I'm just checking the action of the T lever there. The T lever is this little thing here, holds the shutter fully open until such stage as you move the shutter release again, which lifts this and allows the shutter to close again. That's on the T setting. T settings haven't been really a thing on cameras for a few years. Okay, the shutter release lever here. Got a tiny spring on the back of it that you need to be aware of and be careful not to damage. I'm just going to run some molybdenum paste through the pivot point of this, and on those tips of those levers, these fine levers here, on the outside and inside tips of those levers, I'm just putting a little bit of molybdenum paste on there. Now I'll get this in position. You can see as I work that, it opens the shutter on the T setting, and when I swing it back again, it'll open the shutter, it closes the shutter. B, here it is. Okay, that appears to be good. The high-speed spring for the shutter, the 500th of a second speed spring, is here. I'll run some molybdenum paste through the centre of that to lubricate that. That seats over that post there. This lever, amongst its other tasks, is the return spring for our shutter release button. I'll put a wipe of molybdenum paste through the centre of that. I'm going to get this thing under this top of that spring and over the post that it pivots on, like that. The end of it needs to drop into this notch on the shutter release, and while all that's happening I need to get the spring tucked down into the case. Something like that. So now we have a return spring on our shutter release. That looks good. I'll put a touch of molybdenum paste in that notch where the shutter release contacts that lever. This lever here will contact the shutter release at those points. When the shutter's uncocked, this lever will block the action of the shutter release. Okay, so that's looking good. This needs to go in place now. This is the post that the shutter release plunger fits to. So we can slide this in here. Its fixing screw is here, so if I hold the shutter depressed, it swings this lever down out of the way, and it means I can drop that screw in and get to it with a screwdriver. Our shutter release plunger here is somewhat worn, as they most usually are. They don't work particularly well. They will often work fairly reliably for releasing the shutter with gentle pressure, but if you press them all the way down, they will often jam. Well, that one's making a liar of me because it's working quite well. I'm going to put a bit of molybdenum paste on the shaft of that. Just work that in there. The reason they often jam is that the little ball-shaped end of this push rod often wears. It gets a flat spot on it. If it's got a flat spot on it, it won't slide neatly over the end of this lever that it's pressing against. That looks quite good. And the next thing to do is to fit the main lever, and then we'll have a fully powered and high-speed shutter. Well, I'm taking some molybdenum paste here. You could use graphite grease. Just do a couple of spots on the shutter. On the lever here. Where this contacts this little lever here, where that contacts the blade, the main lever, and here where the main lever contacts this piece. Everything else I think is pretty well right. Okay, so the blade, the main lever. I'm going to rub some molybdenum paste through the centre of that. That's where it runs round the lens tube, round the outside edge. That's where the catch is that holds the shutter in the cocked position, acts on that point. On the bird paw here, just making sure that I cover a little tab at the tail. That'll probably just about do us, I think. See if I can get this in position. So first you want to hold back this lever, swing this all the way out the outside, release the first lever. That holds this back out of the way, so that now you can fit this and you don't have to fight with so many things. Drop that spring in under there like that. That lever should drop into position pretty much. I'll hook that spring over its post at the end of the retard gear train there. Check that it sits down behind that. That lever's out, that's down, this lever's not trapped underneath. That's all sitting there ready to go. Here is the shutter speed settings cam plate. I want to take wipe some molybdenum paste through the centre and through the lumps and the bumps here where it acts against the blade, the retard gear train. That should do. Check that the B lever is not trapped underneath here, the lever that acts for the B lever. Well, there it is, it's trapped underneath, that back out where it wants to be. Okay, that should be the T setting there. That should be the B setting, this should be the 1 second. That seems pretty good. 10th should be somewhere around there. That sounds credible. 25th should be somewhere around there. Now that's not cocking. Why is that not cocking? Oh, it's the shutter release sticking. I was using the plunger and the shutter release was sticking down. See, if I just give the shutter release plunger a touch, the shutter will fire, this will return no problem. If you press the shutter plunger all the way down, you may find it sticks. See, if I push that all the way down, now it's jammed and the shutter would not cock again in that position. So you just need to touch that plunger and no more. I'm sure that's not exactly how it was intended to work. That's just in practice how they do tend to work, and it'll all be down to wear and tear, and mostly down to this plunger. The tiny ball shape that's on the end of it, well, we've worn, it'll have a flat on the end of it. It won't slide well over the lever. That appears to be good. I'm checking the 500 per second speed now. That's when that spring is compressed. And the shutter cocks and stays cocked until it's released. So that all appears to be working very well. I don't think I need to do anything else in there now. Let's put this front plate on. Rotate that to lock the bayonet. And just rotate this little locking rivet screw arrangement. I can put the nameplate on the shutter. Check those two screws, and that is the shutter back working again. Neat and tidy, ready to have the lens put back in it and put it back on the camera. The aperture moves smoothly. Whoops, or it would do. I'll tell you something I've done there. Let's have a look. When I put this block in, I hadn't made sure that I had this in the right position, so that the aperture is now blocked from moving by that piece. So let's do the job properly. I was too busy doing other things there, I'm afraid. I'll just hold that shutter release down, remove that screw, swing my aperture lever back over where it should have been, put this back in place, do the screw up tight, release the shutter release, put this all back in place. So what I'd done there effectively was trapped the aperture setting lever by having its pointer on the wrong side of that block there, which meant that the aperture was effectively stuck in the wide open position. And I have to say that's something I've done that before, which is why I knew exactly what was going on with that. All right. Now my T setting's not working correctly. Yeah, something's not right. Back into it. Alright. Can't see it. Well, I think it was probably down to the position of the spring on the main lever. Well, the B lever was lifting slightly higher than it should have done on the cam, and that was what was causing the problem there, so that when we had it set to T you could get B, but when we had it set to B you were getting nothing at all effectively, and it was just lifting the cam was just lifting the B lever up slightly more than it should have done, and that's because the B lever was bent. The B lever, of course, being the piece that I had to straighten out, and presumably it had more than one bend in there and I hadn't noticed that one. Anyway, everything's working correctly now, so that the T works correctly and the B works correctly, and of course the normal speeds all work correctly. On these shutters you do not cock the shutter to use the B or T speed. If you try and do that you'll get nowhere useful. So it's a bit of a catch for young players, that one, because unless you've got a copy of the instructions and you've bothered to read them, you're not going to know that unless you're familiar with the older Compur and Compur Rapid shutters. But there you have it, that shutter is back together, and I'll just clean up the lenses and pop them back on it. Okay, I'm happy with the state of that. The lens is not marvellous, it's cleaning marks from here to Christmas, but there's not much I can do about that. Off camera, I put the shutter and lens assembly back on the camera body and have that all now correctly positioned. I've checked the focus, everything is good. So that means that I've come to the end of this little project. You'll probably remember what it looked like previously. It's looking a lot happier now. So what was involved and what did I have to replace? Well, as I previously mentioned, the bellows were completely shot and I had to replace the bellows. The retaining ring for the shutter, I had to destroy the retaining ring for the shutter in order to get it off the shutter so I could just continue dismantling the camera. So it's got a different retaining ring on the shutter. But apart from that, I don't think there were any other pieces that needed to be replaced. It's all the original leather. I've had it off the back, which is a very unusual thing for me to do, because on these cameras the leather wraps around the edge. So it's a bit of a task to get the leather off the back of one of these models. And the leather on the front, that was of course peeling away. You can see on the top edge there, you can probably see there are two small patches here and here, if they catch the light right, where I've cut in patches. There are a couple of other minor losses on that leather, but I didn't bother patching those. They don't really detract from it, and there's not particularly any value in doing that. But this is now an attractive example of the Retina 1 Type 119 from about 1937, I think, this model. And I think it was $6.50 well spent when I bought this. Thanks for watching.